I swapped the groom after uncovering my fiancé's shocking secret. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. There has been a change of groom. I said it so quietly the officiant leaned in, like I was fixing a flower issue or asking for another minute. Around us, the old chapel at the edge of Charleston glowed with candlelight and expensive lies. 200 guests were already seated. The quartet was halfway through the processional they had practiced for months. My veil felt heavy enough to choke me. Across the aisle, Caleb Mercer stood in a tux that cost more than my first car, smiling the same polished smile that made strangers trust him and made me hate myself for how long I had trusted him too. I'm Sophie Bennett. I manage private events at a boutique hotel downtown, which means I notice details people think are invisible. Missing place cards, changed signatures, deposits that clear from the wrong account, men who look calm because they think they're controlling the room. For almost 2 years, Caleb loved that about me. He called me brilliant under pressure. He said I made chaos look elegant. What I didn't understand until 3 days before the wedding was that he hadn't fallen in love with my calm. He had targeted it. The ceremony was at Magnolia House, a restored estate where I'd once sworn I would only ever work, never marry. Caleb changed that. Or I thought he had. Every white rose, every monogrammed menu, every imported candle was a public promise. My guests weren't just family and friends. They were hotel clients, local donors, old Charleston women who remembered my grandmother, and people Caleb collected the way other men collected watches. If I blew this up and I was wrong, I wouldn't just lose a fiancé. I'd lose my reputation, my job, and the only inheritance my grandmother had ever meant to protect. The officiant blinked. Sophie, what are you saying? I kept my eyes on Caleb. I'm saying the wrong Mercer is waiting for me. His smile finally twitched. Then Caleb saw who was walking in behind the last row of guests. If you had met Caleb when I met him, you would have believed him too. He came into the Harbor House on a Thursday in August, when Charleston felt like wet silk and everyone complained with a smile because rich tourists tipped better in summer. He was hosting a client dinner in one of our private rooms. Navy suit, perfect manners, that dangerous kind of eye contact that makes you feel singled out in a flattering way. I was managing 3 events at once, and he watched me reroute a florist, calm a bride's mother, and fix a seating chart disaster without raising my voice. Do you ever panic? He asked when I finally set down a tray of revised escort cards. Professionally? Never. He laughed like I'd said something clever instead of tired. That's the hottest answer I've heard all year. It should have felt corny. Instead, it felt easy. He sent coffee the next morning with my name written correctly on the cup. He remembered that I hated truffle oil and that I worked late on Saturdays. He asked about my grandmother's old carriage house with respectful curiosity, not greed, or at least not greed I recognized then. When I told him I'd inherited the property and a preservation trust tied to it, he didn't flinch. He just said, "She must have known you were the one who'd protect what mattered." That line got me. Not because it was romantic, but because it sounded like he understood me. Everybody adored him. Danny told me he was aggressively charming, which was her way of saying dangerous without sounding dramatic. Caleb sent my staff cookies at Christmas. He called my dad sir and remembered birthdays. Even when he proposed after 11 months, nobody thought it was too fast because he made speed feel like certainty. The only early thing that bothered me was how smoothly he adjusted himself to the room. With my hotel clients, he talked preservation and architecture. With Danny, he acted loose and funny. With me, he turned soft-voiced and wounded whenever I asked harder questions. Once, 6 months in, I joked, "You know exactly who to be for everyone." He smiled and tucked hair behind my ear. "That's not manipulation, sophomore. That's survival." At the time, I kissed him after he said it. A year later, that sentence sounded very different in my head. The first crack was so small I nearly polished it over myself. 3 months before the wedding, I came home from a 12-hour shift to find Caleb in my kitchen, speaking in a low voice I'd never heard before. Not warm, not smooth, flat. He had one hand over his other phone. Not the phone I knew, the black one he kept face down and called his work backup. He ended the call the second I stepped in. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just vendor nonsense." "What vendor?" He smiled too fast. "You're off duty, remember? No spreadsheets after 6. I let it go because I was tired, and because brides get taught to swallow confusion if the room still looks pretty. Then there was the violinist deposit. I noticed it while reviewing our wedding ledger at work, because numbers relax me and because I had built our budget in color-coded tabs. Caleb had insisted on handling a few of the big payments himself to take something off my plate. One of those was a $4,800 entertainment deposit. The planner marked it paid. My shared folder showed it unpaid. When I asked Caleb, he laughed. "Babe, I moved it through my corporate card for points. It'll post." It did post. From a different account than the one he named. A week later, he missed cake tasting because of an investor dinner. 2 days after that, I found a garment bag receipt in his car from Asheville, North Carolina, dated on a weekend. He told me he was in Atlanta. He explained it away before I even finished asking. Julian borrowed the car. Julian, his younger brother and best man, barely looked at me at Sunday brunch when Caleb said that. He just reached for his coffee and said, "Right. The car." That should have been enough. It wasn't. Love makes you arrogant in a stupid way. You think your version of someone is the truest one, and every contradiction is just poor lighting. The thing that finally unsettled me wasn't even the hidden phone or the wrong receipt. It was how irritated Caleb got whenever wedding paperwork turned legal. Marriage license appointment, vendor contracts, insurance writer, name change forms. "You really know how to make romance feel like an audit," he snapped one night. I laughed like he was kidding. He didn't laugh back. Then our florist called asking why Caleb had approved a second bridal bouquet. The tasting should have been easy. Magnolia House set the long table in the courtyard with crystal water glasses, handwritten menus, and tiny bowls of she crab soup. I knew half the staff by name because I'd worked weddings there for years. Caleb loved that, usually. He liked standing beside me while people praised my competence, as long as it still reflected well on him. That afternoon, something was off from the minute he arrived. He was 30 minutes late, didn't apologize, and kept checking that black phone under the tablecloth. When the chef asked whether we preferred sea bass or filet for the plated dinner, I said, "Sea bass photographs better under candlelight." Caleb leaned back in his chair, smiling for the chef and stabbing me under the ribs at the same time. "Let's let the professionals talk numbers and logistics, sophomore." The chef froze. I felt my face go hot. "I am a professional," I said. He gave my knee a warning squeeze under the table. "At your hotel, sure. This is a little different." It was such a small sentence. That was the worst part. Small enough that if I reacted, I'd look sensitive. Sharp enough that I didn't taste another bite after it. On the drive home, he acted confused by my silence. "You know I was joking, right?" "No, I don't." He sighed. "Everything's life or death with you lately." Maybe I would have let him flip it on me again. Maybe I would have spent the night wondering whether stress had hollowed out my sense of humor. But when I got upstairs, I had a voicemail from the front desk at Harbor House. "Sophie, sorry to bother you off the clock." A woman called asking to confirm the Mercer Reed room block for September 12th. She gave Caleb Mercer's card number, but said the confirmation hadn't come through. "We didn't know if it was one of your wedding overflow blocks." September 12th was 12 days after my wedding date. Mercer Reed. I replayed the voicemail 4 times before I could breathe normally. When Caleb came in behind me, loosening his tie, I turned the phone face down on the counter and looked at him like I had never seen him before. "Who's Reed?" I asked. For the first time since I'd known him, Caleb answered too slowly. Julian's glass slipped from his hand when I said the name at dinner. The next 24 hours were a master class in how many people will help a lie breathe if the truth feels inconvenient. Caleb recovered almost instantly. He told me Reed was a client name from an old hospitality block, that his assistant must have reused the wrong template, that I was spiraling because the wedding was close. He wrapped each explanation in concern, not anger, which somehow made me doubt myself more. "Babe," he said softly in my kitchen, palms open. "You know how many contracts and reservations I handle. You think I'm running a second wedding between board meetings?" When he said it like that, it sounded absurd. Danny did not think it sounded absurd. She came over with Thai food and listened to the voicemail twice. "Nope." "Nope what?" "Nope as in," he answered too cleanly. Innocent people get confused first. Guilty people come prepackaged. I wanted to be mad at her because being mad felt easier than being scared. That's not evidence. Danny shoved her hair behind her ear. "Then get some." Julian was worse. Caleb's family hosted a rehearsal dinner planning meeting 2 nights later, and Julian barely touched his bourbon. When Caleb's mother, who never liked me enough to hide it well, said, "Every bride gets paranoid before the wedding," Julian looked up sharply. "Sophie's not paranoid." It was the first direct thing he'd said to me in weeks. Caleb's gaze cut to him. "You want to add something?" Julian stared at his glass. "No." That silence was louder than the voicemail. I kept trying to act rational. I reviewed the room block log at Harbor House. The caller had used one of Caleb's actual business cards to hold the rooms. 6 king suites. 2 nights. No company name attached. I told myself it could still be explained. Then Caleb called me at work and asked an oddly specific question. "Did you ever move your trust paperwork out of the carriage house office?" I gripped the back of my desk chair. "Why?" "Relax. I'm just thinking ahead. After the wedding, we should consolidate things. Protect your assets better." Protect. That word sat in my stomach like bad wine. That night, Danny looked through me and said, "Sophie, he's not hiding a woman. He's hiding a plan." Then Julian texted me exactly 6 words after midnight. "You need to see what Caleb bought." I didn't answer Julian right away because fear has a ritual to it. First it tells you to wait until morning. Then it tells you not to look at all. At 7:12 a.m., I found him sitting in his truck outside Harbor House, jaw dark with stubble, baseball cap pulled low like he was ashamed to be seen. He handed me a folded printout without saying hello. It was a receipt from Halpern Jewelers dated 4 months after Caleb proposed to me. 1 platinum ring. Oval diamond. Size 7. Total, $18,430. Purchaser, Caleb Mercer. My ring was emerald cut. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Julian scrubbed a hand over his mouth. "I was at his condo helping him with a wine cabinet delivery. It was in the printer tray. He said it was for a client insurance appraisal." "And you believed him?" "No." His voice cracked on the word. "I wanted to." He told me that wasn't all. Caleb had been using Julian's address for mailed statements because his building had package theft. Last week, one envelope split open. Inside was a boutique hotel confirmation from Asheville for a suite booked under C. Mercer and T. Reed. Julian hadn't shown me sooner because, in his words, Caleb has a way of making you feel crazy for noticing patterns. That sounded so familiar, I nearly sat down on the curb. I should have confronted Caleb then. Instead, I did what I always do when something feels wrong. I followed the paper. At work, I checked the card authorization on the Mercer Reed room block call. Same Amex, ending in 4408 that Caleb used for our honeymoon deposit. Then I remembered he had once logged into his email on my iPad during a flight delay and never fully signed out of one account. I hated myself for checking. I checked anyway. Buried under travel confirmations and polished business jargon was a hidden calendar labeled CR Private. Color-coded entries. License pickup. T fitting. S brunch with donors. TR vows draft. My hands went numb. There was also a PDF attachment from a law office in Asheville with the subject line, "Requested certified copy." When I opened it, I stopped breathing halfway through my own name. The certificate didn't list me anywhere. It listed Caleb Mercer and Tessa Reed as husband and wife. I threw up in the Harbor House employee bathroom, rinsed my mouth, fixed my eyeliner, and went back to a charity luncheon like my life hadn't just split open. That was the first surreal thing about learning the truth. The world kept asking me where to place the iced tea. I didn't confront Caleb because the marriage certificate made everything bigger than betrayal. If he had just cheated, he could still twist it. He could say it was emotional, temporary, a mistake. But a filed certificate with a raised seal from Buncombe County was not a mistake. It was infrastructure. So I started building my own. First, I confirmed the record through the county clerk's public portal. Marriage date, May 18th. Officiant registered. License filed May 20th. 3 months after he finalized our venue contract. I printed everything and hid it inside a linen inventory binder at work because no one but me ever touched those. Then I called the Asheville hotel from a block number and asked to verify a reservation for Mrs. Mercer. The receptionist cheerfully confirmed a past stay under Tessa Reed Mercer. Mercer. I sat with that for a full minute, staring at the wall of my office. Danny came over that night with legal pads and no false optimism. "Okay," she said, clicking a pen. "What do we know, what do we need, and how do we keep you from screaming in public before it counts?" We made columns. Dates. Payments. Lies. Caleb had told me he was in Atlanta on May 18th for an investor retreat. I found a forwarded boarding pass in the hidden email account showing Charleston to Asheville. He told me the black phone was for overseas clients. The recent call log synced to the iPad showed late-night calls to one number, saved only as T. The next afternoon, I texted the number. I kept it simple. Hi, my name is Sophie. I think we need to talk about Caleb Mercer. No response for 3 hours. Then one message. Who told you that name? We met at a coffee shop off King Street the next morning. Tessa was wearing the exact bracelet Caleb once told me he had designed only for me. Then she slid a second wedding photo across the table. Tessa looked like someone who had already cried everything useful out of herself. Not cold, not dramatic, just devastatingly calm. In the photo she handed me, Caleb stood barefoot on a mountain overlook in a navy suit, one arm around her waist, grinning into a hired photographer's lens. Tessa wore a simple ivory dress, and the bracelet on her wrist flashed in the sun. On the back of the print, in his handwriting, were the words, "To my first and only wife." I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, because if I didn't laugh, the entire cafe would watch me break in half. Tessa didn't flinch. He told me his family was old Charleston money and snobbish, she said. Said they'd freeze him out if he married a public school counselor from North Carolina before he closed a development deal. So he married you in secret. She nodded once. He said the public wedding later would be for business optics. I thought he meant a fake engagement to keep investors happy. I found your bridal shower pictures online last week. The room tilted. What did he tell you I was? An event consultant he had to stay close to because of donors and venue connections. I closed my eyes. Of course he had turned my actual life into camouflage. Tessa had proof beyond the certificate. A shared photo album. Voice notes. Wire transfers. She had sent him $42,000 over 6 months for closing costs on a house they were supposedly buying after he untangled family trusts. There was no house. There wasn't even an offer. Just urgent reasons, new deadlines, and polished apologies. So yes, she said quietly. He cheated. But that's not the biggest thing. I already knew that in my bones. She pulled out her phone and opened an email forwarded from Caleb's private account to a lender. I recognized my address in the body before I understood the sentence around it. Collateral discussion re. Bennett Carriage House and pending trust disbursement upon marriage. I looked up so fast my neck hurt. How does he know about my trust terms? Tessa swallowed. Because he asked me to research them. For one long second, all I could hear was the espresso machine hissing behind us. Then Tessa slid over one more screenshot, and this one made the whole scheme come into focus. It was a countdown to my 30th birthday with a note beside it. My grandmother's preservation trust was private enough that most people in my life only knew the softened version. Sophie inherited the carriage house and a little money. The full version was less romantic and much more useful to a predator. When my grandmother died, she left the house in my name but put the renovation fund into trust to be released either when I turned 30 or when I married, whichever came first. Her logic was old-fashioned and a little controlling, but it came from fear. She didn't want me rushed into selling the property because maintaining old homes in Charleston is like feeding a beautiful, leaking animal. The amount wasn't generational wealth huge, but it was enough to matter. $620,000 earmarked for restoration, legal upkeep, and emergency stabilization. My 30th birthday was 6 weeks after the wedding. Caleb's debts were due in 3. Danny and I pieced it together that night from documents Tessa had saved and records I pulled through public filings. 2 judgments. 1 delinquent bridge loan. 1 personal guarantee tied to a failed waterfront investment he presented to everyone as delayed. He wasn't rich. He was polished and over-leveraged. The house, the memberships, the suits, all of it balanced on other people's money and his talent for looking inevitable. In one lender email, he wrote, "Once marriage is public, access to trust-backed liquidity becomes straightforward." Trust-backed liquidity. That was me. My grandmother's grief, my property, my future, turned into a phrase a banker could skim between meetings. I found a voice note too. Caleb's voice, low and impatient. "No, 6 weeks is too late. By then the note gets called. I need the ceremony first. Once Sophie feels this is ours, she'll move faster than a lawyer." I listened to that 12 times. Tessa sat beside me on Danny's couch while I did, her face blank in the way only shocked people's faces go blank. So he marries me publicly. I said, every word tasting metallic. Stays married to you privately, and uses the wedding to pressure me into unlocking the trust before I turn 30. Danny nodded. And if you ever find out, he paints you as unstable. That was the moment the choice changed. I wasn't deciding whether to leave a liar. I was deciding whether to let a con man narrate me first. Then Caleb texted that he wanted to discuss our post-wedding finances at family dinner. I almost canceled the whole thing after that text. Not because I wanted to spare Caleb. Because I wanted out. I wanted silence, sweatpants, ugly crying, my phone off, and a version of humiliation that happened privately. Public exposure sounds empowering when you're angry. It feels less empowering when you're the woman who has to stand in the center of a room full of dressed-up witnesses and admit she almost married a stranger. Family dinner was at Caleb's mother's house, all polished silver and inherited portraits. I went because not going would tip my hand, and because I needed to hear how bold he would get now that I knew enough to fear him. He was in a perfect mood. That should have terrified me more than it did. Halfway through the main course, he lifted his wine glass and smiled at me. Soph and I have been talking about smarter ways to structure assets after the honeymoon. Fewer silos, more shared planning. I set down my fork. That's interesting. We haven't talked about that at all. His smile stayed in place, but only on his mouth. We've talked around it. Julian choked on his drink. Caleb kept going, smooth as satin. Marriage means acting like a team. Sometimes that means not being sentimental about old properties and trust restrictions. Old properties. Trust restrictions. He was doing it in public now, testing what he could normalize. Later, in the hallway, he cornered me between the powder room and the staircase. His voice dropped. You're being strange, he said. If this is about some rumor, tell me now. What rumor would that be? He stared at me for a beat too long. You tell me. Then he switched tactics like a man changing ties. Look, I'm under pressure. There are some short-term cash timing issues. Nothing dramatic. If you love me, don't make this month harder than it already is. That almost got me. Not the guilt, the exhaustion in his face. I could suddenly see how he had probably sold the same near-tears honesty to Tessa, to lenders, to anyone standing between him and a deadline. Danny found me in the driveway gripping the porch rail. You do not owe dignity to a man planning your theft, she said. When I got home, Julian was waiting outside my apartment with Caleb's deleted email archive on a flash drive. Julian said, before you decide whether to hate me too, you should know I didn't get brave all at once. We sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, the flash drive between us like evidence in a trial neither of us wanted to attend. Caleb had used Julian's old laptop months earlier, and because Caleb believed he was smarter than everyone, he never checked what synced where. Julian found the archive after I showed him the marriage certificate and realized just how far beyond messy this had gone. Inside were hundreds of emails. Some were ordinary. Investor decks, dinner reservations, golf confirmations. The useful ones were worse because they were so practical. Draft operating agreements naming me in ventures I had never seen. Notes about staging credibility. A jeweler's message confirming both ring timelines accommodated. One exchange with a private lender included my carriage house address, projected trust release dates, and the sentence, public ceremony resolves optics. Optics. That word made me colder than love ever had. We built the trap carefully because one dramatic speech would never beat a man like Caleb. He would interrupt, charm, deny, and turn every contradiction into confusion. We needed sequence, proof, witnesses. No room for him to outrun the facts. Danny handled the venue tech through one of my contacts at Magnolia House. I quietly swapped the rehearsal slideshow file for a presentation folder labeled Family Montage. Tessa sent certified copies of the Asheville marriage record and bank transfers. Julian agreed to testify to the second ring receipt, the mailed statements, and Caleb using his address. I printed everything twice, one set in a linen box beneath the escort cards, one set with the officiant packet. The officiant only needed one sentence from me the morning of the ceremony. Do not begin until I nod. I also changed one other detail. The aisle lineup listed Best Man, Julian Mercer. On my private copy, next to Caleb's name, I wrote one word in pencil. Removed. I wasn't planning to marry anyone else that day, but I was done letting Caleb define what the altar meant. At midnight, Tessa called and asked the question none of us had said out loud. What if he still finds a way to make you look unstable? I looked at the folder of dates, signatures, transfers, and vows he had recycled. Then he'll have to do it while standing beside his wife. The wedding morning started with Caleb sending me a single rose and a handwritten note. The note said, "I know we've had stress, but after today, everything becomes simple." That was the final insult. Not the lie. The confidence. By 4:30, Magnolia House looked like a magazine spread. White florals climbing the chapel railings. Gold chairs in perfect symmetry. Candlelight trembling against old wood. Guests smiling into their phones because people love a beautiful beginning, even when it belongs to the wrong story. Caleb looked devastating in his tux. That mattered, unfortunately. Men like him weaponize appearances. He took his place at the altar beside Julian, one hand folded over the other, expression solemn and expensive. People actually sighed. Then the doors opened, and I walked in. I had expected to feel shaky. Instead, I felt weirdly clear. Every lie had simplified me. The dress fit. My spine was straight. I carried my bouquet the way I carry crisis at work. Carefully, like breaking would only waste time. When I reached the front, the officiant smiled and asked quietly, "Ready?" I said, "There has been a change of groom." Murmurs rippled through the first rows. Caleb gave a small laugh for the guests. "Sophie, don't." I turned, nodded once toward the side entrance, and Danny hit play from the AV station. The screen behind the altar lit up with the certified marriage record from Buncombe County, Caleb Mercer and Tessa Reed. Filed May 20th. Seal visible. Signature visible. Silence hit the room so hard it sounded physical. Then came the ring receipt. The Asheville hotel confirmation. The wire transfers from Tessa. The lender email about my trust. Finally, the voice note, amplified through chapel speakers. "Once Sophie feels this is ours, she'll move faster than a lawyer." Someone gasped. Someone else said, "Oh my God," like a prayer. Caleb stepped toward the screen. "This is insane. Julian, turn this off." Julian didn't move. The side doors opened again. Tessa walked in wearing navy, not white, carrying her own folder. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She stood 3 feet from Caleb and said, perfectly clearly, "You're already married to me." That was when his face changed. Not embarrassed. Not wounded. Furious. Then Caleb looked at me and forgot there were 200 witnesses listening. He called me a vicious little opportunist. That's the cleaned-up version. The real version came out sharp and ugly and panicked, every polished layer dropping off him in strips. He pointed at Tessa and called her unstable. He pointed at Julian and called him jealous. He turned to the guests and tried to laugh like the whole thing was some grotesque misunderstanding. But his voice had gone too high and no one in that room had ever heard him sound anything less than controlled. Then he lunged for the tablet Danny was using to run the file queue. Security moved before I did. Magnolia House keeps discreet security for donor events and political fundraisers, and 2 men in black suits were suddenly between Caleb and the front row. Guests stood. Chairs scraped. Someone started filming openly. His mother sat frozen with one hand over her mouth. Tessa didn't raise her voice once. "You took $42,000 from me," she said. "You filed a marriage certificate with my name on it. You told me your family would publicly reject me, so I should stay hidden." I held up the printed lender email. My hand shook only after I started speaking. "You told a creditor my grandmother's trust would become straightforward liquidity once this ceremony happened. You were never marrying me. You were staging access." That landed harder than the affair. People understand greed. They especially understand greed hiding behind vows. The immediate fallout was messy and weirdly administrative. Caleb's lender called the next morning because someone in attendance forwarded the presentation. Tessa filed civil claims within the week. One of the judgments against Caleb accelerated. An attorney sent me a stern letter implying defamation until Danny replied with 3 attachments and the words "try discovery." I wish I felt triumphant. Mostly I felt hollow. My wedding dress hung from the back of my bedroom door for 4 days because I couldn't bear to zip it into a garment bag. Videos from the ceremony leaked, and for one humiliating weekend my face floated around local gossip accounts under captions like "Charleston bride exposes double groom lie." Harbor House stood by me, but not without consequences. Clients asked questions. A donor canceled a luncheon because she didn't want drama attached to the property. The only person who never asked me to be less inconvenient was Julian. 6 months later, He handed me the one thing Caleb never could. It wasn't a ring. That's what made me trust it. 6 months after the wedding, that wasn't. I was in therapy twice a month, sleeping through the night again, and learning that humiliation leaves the body slower than heartbreak. Caleb's cases were still dragging through court. Tessa and I texted more than either of us expected. Trauma does strange things to the map of your life. Danny remained Danny, gloriously blunt, impossible to intimidate, the first person to tell me that survival deserved nicer lipstick. Julian stayed careful. He helped me inventory damage at the carriage house after a summer storm. He came by Harbor House with coffee when he knew I had back-to-back wedding weekends. He never once used the phrase "after everything we've been through." He never treated decency like an investment that should yield romance. One afternoon, while we were repainting shutters at the carriage house, he set down his brush and said, "I brought you something." It was a manila folder. Inside were the finalized court acknowledgments that my trust and property had never been touched, plus copies showing Caleb's fraudulent representations had been entered into the record. Clean lines. Stamps. Finality. Not romance. Relief. I thought. Julian said, looking at the porch floor instead of me. "You might sleep better with paper." I laughed so hard I almost cried. That was the first day I kissed him. We still moved slowly after that. Slow enough that nobody could call it rebound without sounding foolish. Slow enough that my body learned the difference between charm and steadiness. A year after the disaster at Magnolia House, he asked me to marry him in the carriage house kitchen while I was barefoot and covered in flour. No photographer. No speech rehearsed in a mirror. Just, "I love you, and I will never ask you to doubt your own eyes for me." We got married 3 months later in the courtyard at Harbor House with 20 people present. Danny stood beside me. Tessa came in blue silk and hugged me before the ceremony. Julian wore a simple dark suit. I wore a dress I could breathe in. Same city, same bride, different Mercer. When the officiant smiled and asked if there were any changes, I laughed first. I used to think red flags arrive like thunder. They don't. Not usually. Sometimes they arrive as tiny edits to your reality. A joke that lands like a bruise. A document someone doesn't want you to read closely. A phone turned face down too often. A person who is endlessly gentle until you ask for clarity, and then suddenly you are too intense, too suspicious, too emotional, too detail-oriented. If that last one sounds familiar, listen to it especially hard. Manipulative people do not hate your fear. They hate your pattern recognition. I also used to think dignity meant leaving quietly. Now I think dignity means refusing to carry someone else's lies just because they would look ugly in the light. Do I love that 200 people watched the worst day of my adult life crack open in public? No, I still don't. There are videos of that chapel I will never watch again. There are songs from that string quartet I still skip. There are women in Charleston who probably remember me as that bride before they remember my actual name. But the story they tell about me now is not the one Caleb wrote. The carriage house is restored. The shutters are the right historic green because Julian actually reads preservation guidelines instead of pretending to. The trust paid for brickwork, foundation repair, and a roof that doesn't leak over the upstairs landing anymore. Danny still says my first marriage saved me from my second divorce. Tessa is engaged now to a woman who, according to her, thinks secret phones are for drug dealers and cowards, which honestly feels correct. If you are planning a wedding and something in you keeps whispering that the numbers don't line up, the timeline feels slippery, or the person beside you gets offended by ordinary questions, pause everything. Love does not punish scrutiny. Real partnership survives documents. Healthy people do not need darkness to stay adored.